everyone. So this lecture will be focusing on oxygen consumption, specifically oxygen consumption in relation to exercise intensity, limiting factors for VO2 max, and concepts of oxygen deficit and oxygen debt and how they apply to exercise intensity. Okay, so starting off relatively simple, we can see as exercise intensity increases, our oxygen consumption will increase until we hit that little circle point on the graph there, which is our VO2 max. So remember, the VO2 max is the amount of oxygen that you can take up and use within the body. So once you hit that limit, it flattens off, and you'll see that that also means your exercise intensity might still be able to go up, but we're going to be pushing into that lactic acid glycolytic system. Give you a bit of a gauge of VO2 max. We've got a little bit of graph on the right side there. Females are in the top, males are in the bottom. You can see it sedentary, very low VO2 max. Weightlifters have a slightly higher VO2 max, rowers higher again, then cyclists, speed skaters, middle distance runners, and cross-country skiers. Then similar in the females, except you can see that the weightlifters have been replaced with the fencers. So it's just to give you a bit of an idea of the aerobic demand of certain exercises and how VO2 max goes up in relation to training stimulus. If we were doing a VO2 max test, there's a few things that we would use as criteria to assess whether or not we'd actually hit the client's actual VO2 max, because their fatigue could set in for other reasons limiting their performance. So to see if it was the actual VO2 max, we would expect there to be a plateau in the oxygen consumption. Nice and simple, that graph that we looked at a couple of slides ago, it goes up, it goes up, it goes up, and it flattens off as that exercise intensity goes up. We would expect the RER to be sitting at about that 1.15 range, so that maximum level, so we're getting that maximum glycolytic input most likely going as well. Blood lactate would raise up from its baseline around 2 millimoles up to 8 to 10 millimoles per litre. We would expect them to be running close to, if not at, the age predicted maximum heart rate, and their RPE should be greater than 18. Remember that RPE is based off of the Borg scale of RPE, which goes from 6 to 20, with 6 representing rest, because your age predicted maximum heart rate for a 20-year-old athlete, which is where it came from, would have been 60 beats per minute, and 20 being max because it would be 200. On a 1 to 10 scale, 18 is essentially a 9.5. Over the next few slides, we'll be looking at a few factors that can limit your VO2 max. As you can see on this slide, they're broadly broken down into two categories, which is the O2 delivery, so that how much O2 you can actually get into the body from the lungs, and then that O2 utilization through the peripherals of the body, so through your muscle tissue. With the most obvious, your level of conditioning will have a massive impact on your VO2 max. If you haven't been training your aerobic system to that level, you would expect your VO2 max would be much lower, which is represented on the graph on the right, with pre-training in the blue line and post-training in the red line. So remember, this is about chronic adaptation that we're talking about here. This isn't session to session. So yes, we would expect as you train, your VO2 max would go up. However, there are some statistical outliers where that potentially may not. Next factor to consider that affects VO2 max is gender. So when we look at the untrained population, women generally tend to have a 20 to 25% lower VO2 max than males. However, when we look at the trained population, that difference narrows down to about 10%. Part of the reason that we see that big difference is because the VO2 max, remember, is the max amount of oxygen you can take in and use. Men can usually take in slightly more because of a bigger lung capacity, but more importantly, they can use a lot more because they have a higher tissue volume. So because men have that increased musculature in the upper body, they have more muscle tissue which can utilize VO2. Generally speaking, the female equivalent have the same height and training status. We have to consider age as a factor. So you can see on the graphs on the right there that as you go through puberty, we see a massive spike in VO2 max with boys and girls starting at roughly the same, but as they get into the 18 to 20s, we see that big gap open up between them. And then once we start heading past that sort of 25 range, we see that steady decline as we head towards 60, with that VO2 max starting to decrease over time. Obviously, training status does affect this, but even in the highly trained, we will see that decrease over time in VO2 max. There are a few different potential reasons for this change as we age. One being the decreased muscle mass. So as we talked about with the difference between men and women's VO2 max is largely to their peripheral utilization of O2 through muscle mass. We know that as we age, if you do not put in significant effort into training, we see a decline in muscle mass over time, or atrophy as it is called. We also see an increase in our plasticity of our lungs, so they become less pliable, meaning they are less able to fully expand and fully collapse. So we have a decrease in the amount of oxygen making into the bodies. And yeah, there are other couple of factors to consider. Firstly, we have the exercise modality. So most people will see a greater improvement in the modality that they actually train in their VO2 max, which is why even if we put a runner on a bike, they won't reach the same level of VO2 uptake and utilization as they would if they were doing the running, because they are not as specialized in that mode of exercise. So the exercise economy is not as good. Two words you need to be aware of: mode and economy. And then we also have heredity. So their genetics that they inherit from their parents can accounts for slightly less than 50% of that variation in their training responses. So that doesn't mean that there is completely predetermined by the genetics, but it does mean that they will hit essentially a genetic cap in their VO2 max adaptability once they hit a certain level. Alright guys, now I want you to take a moment, pause the video and think over this question. So once an athlete has achieved the genetically determined peak of VO2 max, they can still increase their endurance performance. Why do you think that this might be? The reasons why their their performance can still improve even though their VO2 max has not improved. One is because they're actually able to maintain that high VO2 max level for a longer period of time before they see a decline. And then also we have the increase in the individual's lactic threshold, so the level of VO2 where that lactate actually starts to accumulate, so they're not having as much of that limiting factors there, because remember that lactate has to be metabolized with oxygen as well. And then we also have their increase in exercise economy, so how efficient they are at producing that movement pattern repeatedly over time. Just to reiterate guys, just like that heart rate and exercise intensity graph, as exercise intensity goes up, our heart rate will go up, but also our oxygen consumption will go up. So remember, our heart rate goes up because it's trying to increase the supply of O2 to the working tissues that need them. So it's a linear relationship until we hit that plateau. Alright guys, now we're getting to the good stuff. So we talked about this graph on the first lecture of this course when I was scribbling on the board like a madman. So you can see in that blue line that the aerobic system takes longer to kick in at a given exercise intensity. So when we're looking at this scale, none of these lines represent the exercise intensity. They represent the percentage of each energy system contributing to attain a certain level of exercise intensity. So at the start, that first few seconds, we see that their ATP-CP, or that phosphocreatine system, contributes very highly, as the aerobic system has yet to contribute basically anything to that change in exercise intensity. Then we see the glycolytic system coming up to fill that space again, and then as that aerobic system increases its energy production, we see that the glycolytic system starts to decrease. So this is to stay at a given exercise intensity. So remember, every time you go up in exercise intensity after this, that same process will happen again and again and again every time we staircase that intensity up. Onto the oxygen deficit. So we can see that that's the purple shaded in area on that graph on the right side. So you would see that if they were on this graph, that the phosphocreatine in the glycolytic system would be filling that space, just like on the previous graph. But that aerobic exercise is still gradually going up until it reaches that steady point where it's producing enough aerobic energy to essentially satiate our needs for oxygen for that given exercise intensity. The concept is oxygen deficit. Guys, here's another stop and think question for you. So why do you think that you still are puffing and taking in more O2 even though you have stopped exercising? So based on what we talked about just before, the oxygen deficit, why do you think when you stop exercising we have this increased consumption? This is our last key concept for this section of the course, is oxygen debt. So you can see highlighted in the blue section on that graph that oxygen deficit occurs. So the difference between the amount of O2 that is required for a given exercise intensity and the amount of O2 that the body is supplying. So remember, we're making up that difference with the creatine phosphate system and the glycolytic system. However, that does mean that at the end, once we have achieved a steady state of exercise and we stop exercising, we now have what's called an oxygen debt. So in that highlighted area in the blue, we took out a nice wee loan from our creatine phosphate system and our glycolytic system, but now they've come to collect. So once we're no longer producing that exercise intensity and we're starting to return to rest, we have an increased oxygen consumption above rest still, so that our body can begin to return to homeostasis. So that oxygen or energy production is used so that we can essentially start to reload those other systems, so we can start putting more energy in our body towards trying to recreate those phosphocreatine molecules to start to restore those glycogen stores in our body. So we will start to reverse that glycolytic process with the leftover pyruvate and lactic acid that we have, so we can turn that back into glucose, which can then restore our glycogen reserves and our resting blood glucose levels, as well as a whole bunch of other things around returning our thermoregulation back to normal, returning our hormone levels back to where they were, which all takes energy. So remember, when you go into high intensity exercise, the tiger's chasing you, we have that adrenaline spike, so your body's going to have to return that back to normal. We have that blood distribution changing back to the digestive organs, away from the muscle tissue and away from the skin. So there are a whole bunch of factors that actually need to be set back to a normal homeostatic level at rest, which is why we have this oxygen debt. So that O2 is being used to return all of those factors back to where they were at rest. But remember, every time your exercise intensity goes up, you go back into a deficit. So this just shows one increment. But if we put that exercise intensity up again, we'll go through the same thing, and then the same thing, and then the same thing, which means we have a greater and greater oxygen debt at the end of exercise to start repairing tissue, replacing the used up glucose and glycogen in the blood, restocking our creatine phosphate, returning our hormone levels back to normal, returning our body temperature back to normal, and yeah, all that kind of stuff. Let's recap. So during submaximal oxygen exercise, oxygen consumption increases as exercise intensity increases. So it's a linear relationship until we end up hitting our maximum exercise intensity, where it becomes a plateau. We also O2 uptake increases slowly during our initial work period, so that links back into that concept of our oxygen deficit, so it doesn't immediately kick back in. So as the third point states, that leaves us with an oxygen deficit, which we then need to replace with anaerobic energy systems like that creatine phosphate system and our glycolytic system to fill that space, fill that deficit. And then once we complete exercising, we still have that remaining oxygen debt in the body to try and return everything back to homeostasis. So we're talking about those things again, like restocking that glycolytic energy that we used, restoring our glycogen within our body, restoring our creatine phosphate levels, returning hormones back to normal, and returning our body temperature back to normal.